The sun wasn't even fully up yet, but the top floor of Hale Corporation already felt like the air was holding its breath. Executives crowded the long glass table, whispering like they were afraid the walls themselves might expose them. Nervous eyes, tight jaws, papers shuffled with trembling fingers. Something was coming, something none of them were prepared for. At the very end of the table sat CEO Richard Hale, but this morning he didn't look like a powerful man. He looked like someone waiting on a sentence. His gaze kept drifting, not to the lawyers, not to the board members, but to the black janitor standing quietly in the corner, pushing a mop across the floor like this was any ordinary morning. Marcus Daniels, invisible to them until today. He moved slowly, calm, steady, a man used to the weight of silence. But everyone in that room felt it. Something about him was different, something they had never bothered to notice. A senior executive leaned toward another. Why is he here? Why isn't he out cleaning the lobby? No answer. Only Richard's eyes locked on Marcus, like he was the only person who could end this crisis or unleash it. Marcus wrung the mop, water dripping back into the bucket. Every droplet seemed louder than the room full of panicked millionaires. Finally, the tension snapped. Richard stood, his voice cracked before the words even formed. Marcus. His hands shook. His breath broke. Please make it fast. The entire board froze. A CEO, a man worth billions, begging a janitor. He looked at Marcus like a man drowning, praying the one person he ignored his whole life might now save him. Marcus didn't move at first. Then he slowly lifted his hands from the mop. Hands steady, deliberate. Hands that suddenly made every executive's heart stop. A whisper spread through the room. What is going on? Why him? What does he know? Marcus stepped forward. 3 steps, each one heavier than truth. And as he reached the table's edge, every voice, every breath, every doubt fell silent. Because whatever this janitor was about to do, whatever secret he carried into this room, what they didn't know would change everything. Before that boardroom morning, before a CEO whispered a plea to a janitor, the story of Marcus Daniels had already begun long ago in places no one at Hale Corporation ever cared to look. Marcus arrived at the building each morning before the city yawned awake. He swiped his ID, nodded politely to the half-asleep security guard, and moved through the marble lobby with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to survive by never asking the world for anything. Some people greeted him. Most didn't. Marcus had mastered the art of blending in, moving through hallways where suits talked loudly about mergers and profits, never noticing the man picking up the coffee cups they left behind. That invisibility was something he understood too well, and in a way he depended on it. Marcus lived alone in a small apartment outside the city, plain walls, one window, one worn sofa. No one at the corporation knew anything about his life beyond the mop and the uniform. They didn't know about the framed certificates tucked in a drawer or the old photograph of a younger Marcus in a different uniform, one that required precision, discipline, and respect. They didn't know he had once been someone the world listened to, not forgotten, but locked away. He carried a memory he never spoke about, a night he buried so deep that sometimes he convinced himself it wasn't real. He had learned to keep the past closed like a book no longer worth opening. He'd taken the job because it let him start over. It let him be unseen without disappearing from life entirely. People walked past him without looking too long, and for years that was exactly what he wanted. But Hale Corporation was a place that had a way of reminding people of what the world could do to anyone who didn't fit its picture of safe. While Marcus tried to shrink into silence, Richard Hale lived at the center of noise, wealth, power, influence. The kind of man whose footsteps echoed differently in a building not because they were louder, but because people always made room for them. Richard came from a family that taught him 2 things early. Reputation is everything and mercy is optional. He built his empire on discipline and fear, pushing employees until they broke, firing without blinking, demanding perfection while giving very little humanity in return. Lately, however, cracks had begun to show. Richard grew restless, more meetings behind closed doors. Phone calls ended when others entered. More nights staring at the skyline, looking like a man haunted by something he couldn't outrun. And somehow his eyes started to drift toward Marcus. The first hint came months before the boardroom confrontation. Marcus was wiping the executive floor late one evening when he saw Richard walking toward the elevator with a folder pressed tight to his chest, face pale and steps unsteady. As he passed Marcus, Richard stopped. He looked at Marcus like he recognized him or feared him or both. He said nothing, just nodded and walked away. Marcus paused, confused, then returned to cleaning, but the moment left a shadow. That night, while locking up his cart, a memory flashed through him, bright lights, a shouting officer, the words he matches the description. Marcus shook it off. He didn't believe in coincidences anymore. Patterns weren't accidents, they were warnings, and Richard Hale was starting to look like one. Days passed, weeks. Richard's glances grew more frequent, longer, almost terrified. Executives noticed and made small jokes. Why does he keep staring at the janitor? Is he losing it? Maybe he thinks the guy stole something. Casual disrespect, the kind Marcus heard but pretended not to. He had learned long ago that when people expect nothing from you, they show their true selves. Marcus moved through the building and saw more than they realized: corruption hidden behind polished floors, cruelty wrapped in expensive suits, secrets whispered after hours. He kept his distance. He didn't want trouble. He didn't want recognition. He wanted peace. One night in his small apartment, Marcus received a message from an unknown number. "They're reopening the case. Have you told them who you are?" His heart slowed. The past he had buried, the part of his life he prayed would stay untouched, was knocking. He closed the phone and rubbed his hands together, the same hands that once held steady strength now trembling with memory. He whispered to himself, "I'm not that man anymore," but the world wasn't going to let him hide, not this time. Three things happened in the days before the boardroom meeting that made the air taste like storm. A legal investigator walked into the building demanding old security files. Two executives had a heated argument in the hallway, mentioning a victim and wrongful force. And Richard Hale seemed to be aging by the hour, skipping meetings, pacing, rubbing his temples like pain was clawing through him. All three events pointed to one quiet truth. Someone was in trouble, someone was hiding something big, and someone wasn't going to remain invisible. On the morning everything changed, Marcus pushed his mop through the lobby, humming softly under his breath, unaware he would be pulled into a room full of powerful people who had no idea who they were dealing with. He rode the elevator to the executive floor carrying a bucket and a small, careful smile. At the end of the hallway stood Richard Hale, eyes hollow and hands shaking, looking at Marcus like a ghost had walked into daylight. Marcus nodded politely and walked past. Richard whispered something under his breath, too soft for others to hear but loud enough for the guilt to tremble through him. "Please, don't make me face this." The collision was coming, two lives on opposite ends of power, one trying to bury a past, the other trying to survive it. The truth that connected them was ready to explode, and neither of them would leave the room the same. The day everything broke didn't start with shouting or chaos. It started with silence, the kind that feels wrong even before you understand why. Marcus stepped out of the service elevator with his cleaning cart, but something in the air felt tighter, like the whole building was holding its breath. The lobby was too quiet. The receptionists whispered instead of greeting people. Security guards kept checking their radios, their eyes flicking toward the elevators as if expecting someone important or dangerous. Marcus didn't ask questions. He'd learned long ago that people show you more when they think you're not listening. So he kept moving, pushing his cart down the hallway, letting the building's tension wrap around him until it spoke its own truth. On the executive floor, everything became clearer. A group of sharply dressed lawyers hurried past him, talking fast and low. An executive pulled out his phone, ended the call the moment Marcus walked by, then glared like Marcus had overheard something he wasn't supposed to. Another executive passed him with a stack of folders clutched to her chest, whispering, "It's bad, it's really bad," before disappearing into a conference room. Marcus kept cleaning, even though his heart beat a little faster. He knew what this energy felt like. He had seen it before, the atmosphere of people trying to hide something that was about to surface. Just after 9, the elevator opened again. This time, a man in a gray suit stepped out, carrying a briefcase marked with a legal department seal. He had the heavy look of someone who came to deliver truth, not protect it. He flashed his badge to security and said one sentence that made Marcus's hands freeze mid-wipe. "I'm here for the files related to the security incident from 7 years ago." 7 years ago. Marcus felt the world tilt. Not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for his chest to tighten. The guard nodded stiffly and pointed him toward the internal investigation office. The lawyer walked off, his footsteps echoing with purpose, and Marcus quietly placed the cloth back on his cart. His mind wasn't supposed to go back there. He spent years building walls around that memory, but this morning the world seemed determined to climb them. He tried to push it aside and continued wiping down the edge of a dark wooden counter. But that's when he heard two executives arguing around the corner, voices tense, barely above a whisper. Who filed the complaint? No one knows. They said the victim contacted them directly. Victim after all these years. Apparently he has proof. That can't happen if the board finds out. Then the CEO is finished. The hallway fell silent again when they realized Marcus was nearby. They didn't say a word as they passed him. They didn't have to. Their fear was enough. Marcus walked into the supply room, closed the door gently, and leaned his head against the wall. His eyes shut for a moment longer than a blink. The past crept in: the shouting officer, the confusion, the force used on him without cause, the paperwork that labeled him as a threat, the report that twisted the story. He had spent years pretending that chapter was done, but the men in suits were speaking about it like it had been sitting on their desks this entire time. He took a slow breath and stepped back into the hallway, just in time to see Richard Hale storm out of his office. His face was pale, almost colorless, and his hand trembled as he wiped his forehead. When he saw Marcus, he froze. Not for a second, not for a moment, for long enough that the executives nearby exchanged confused glances. Richard opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, swallowed hard, and tried again, but nothing came out. It was Marcus who broke the tension with a simple nod, the same way he greeted everyone in the building. "Morning, sir." The CEO's eyes darted around as if terrified someone might hear what he wasn't saying. He stepped closer, lowering his voice until it was barely a breath. You don't have to do this." Marcus frowned, unsure what Richard meant. But before he could respond, another executive called Richard back into his office. Richard hesitated, looking at Marcus with a pleading expression that didn't belong on a man of his status, then turned away. Marcus continued his rounds, but his heart felt heavier with every step. Something was unraveling. Something that tied Richard Hale, the board, the lawyers, and the files from 7 years ago directly to him. Later in the morning, Marcus cleaned the glass near the conference room where the internal investigator was meeting with senior directors. Voices spilled through the door in brief fragments. Inconsistent statements. The victim was unarmed. Accusations of profiling. Documentation was altered. CEO's approval is on the authorization form. Marcus stepped back from the glass, hands shaking slightly. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Everything he suffered in silence, the injury, the debt, the damage to his life, had been reduced to a stack of papers being debated behind a closed door. He didn't realize someone was watching him until he turned and found Richard standing in the hallway. This time, the CEO didn't pretend not to stare. He approached Marcus with slow, uneven steps. For the first time since Marcus met him, Richard didn't look like the most powerful man in the room. He looked like someone cornered by consequences. "Marcus," he whispered, his voice trembling, "please, don't make this worse." Marcus didn't answer, not because he was being cold, but because he had no idea what Richard thought he had done. His silence only made Richard panic more. Just talk to me," Richard pleaded. "We can fix this. I can explain everything." Marcus looked him dead in the eye and said quietly, "Explain what?" Richard's face crumbled, and he stepped back like the question itself was a wound. Before anything else could be said, another lawyer arrived and called Richard into an emergency meeting. He hurried away, leaving Marcus standing alone in the hallway with a growing sense that the ground beneath his life was shifting. By noon, the tension had reached the entire building. Employees whispered about board members arguing, lawyers demanding access to restricted floors, and the CEO's face looking like someone had drained the life straight out of him. When Marcus pushed his cart into the cafeteria, conversations stopped around him. People glanced at him, then looked away quickly, almost guilty. He ignored it, until a young intern hurried over, eyes wide with panic. "Marcus," she whispered, "they're calling everyone from the executive floor to a mandatory meeting. They're looking for you too." "Me?" Marcus asked quietly. She nodded quickly. "They said you're part of the questioning." "Questioning?" Marcus felt a wave pass through him, not fear, not shock, but something colder. A confirmation, an acknowledgement of the inevitable. He thanked the intern softly, and walked toward the elevator. Inside, alone, his reflection stared back at him. Older, tired, carrying years no one here ever bothered to see. The elevator doors closed slowly, as if giving him time to reconsider walking into whatever waited above. But Marcus didn't flinch. He had survived worse. As the elevator climbed toward the executive floor, his heartbeat stayed steady. The same steady rhythm he learned to rely on back in the life he never talked about, the one he left behind. When the doors slid open, a group of executives stood waiting. Not one looked him in the eye. "Marcus," one of them said stiffly, "you need to come with us. The board wants to speak to you." Marcus's face gave nothing away. He nodded once and followed them down the hallway, his steps calm even as their own pace quickened. Inside the boardroom, people rose from their seats the moment he appeared. And that was the moment Richard Hale stood up, eyes full of dread and desperation, and whispered the first words of a confession he had avoided for 7 years. "Marcus, please make it fast." When Richard's trembling words left his mouth, the room shifted. Executives exchanged quick, panicked glances. Some looked confused. Others looked offended that a janitor had been brought here at all. A few stared at Marcus like he was suddenly someone they should fear. Marcus did not move. He didn't understand why the CEO was speaking to him like he held a blade over the man's career. All he had done was show up to work. One board member cleared her throat. She folded her hands, trying to restore a sense of control that had been slipping since sunrise. "Mr. Daniels," she said carefully, "we need to ask you some questions regarding an old security incident. You may be connected to the matter." Connected? Such a clean word for something that never felt clean. Marcus nodded once. "I'll answer whatever I can." Richard closed his eyes like those words hurt him. The lead investigator, the man in the gray suit from earlier, opened a folder thick with documents. He studied Marcus with curiosity, almost caution. "Mr. Daniels," he began, "records show that 7 years ago, a man was mistakenly identified as a threat by company security. Excessive force was used. The incident was justified internally, but an external review recently suggested evidence was mishandled." Executives shifted uncomfortably. The investigator continued. "The victim never pursued charges. He disappeared. But weeks ago, new documents were sent anonymously naming the CEO and certain board members. The whistleblower claims there was a cover-up." He paused, "and that the victim has resurfaced." A quiet tremor moved through the room. Richard's eyes darted to Marcus again. The investigator did not miss it. "Mr. Hale," he said, turning sharply, "you've been staring at Mr. Daniels all morning. Is there something we should know?" The CEO's voice cracked. I thought he might be the victim." Gasps circled the table. Several board members turned toward Marcus with new eyes, scanning him as if trying to recognize a wound they had never bothered to see. Marcus felt heat rising under his collar. Not embarrassment, not shame. Recognition. The entire room waited for his answer, breath suspended between truth and denial. Marcus remained silent. He wasn't ready. Not yet. The investigator stepped closer. "Mr. Daniels," he said gently, "were you the man involved in that incident?" Marcus opened his mouth, but before he could speak, one of the senior board members slammed her notebook shut. "This is ridiculous. We cannot rely on speculation. The janitor was not harmed on our property. If he had been, we would have known." She said it casually, confidently. Like men like him did not deserve to be remembered. Marcus's jaw tightened. He wasn't a man who liked confrontation, but there was a particular sting in being told you couldn't possibly be the victim because no one important would have forgotten. Another executive crossed his arms. "This is wasting everyone's time. He's just here to clean. Why would the victim ever work for the same company that hurt him? It makes no sense." Their words dug into Marcus in a way they didn't intend, not cruelly, but ignorantly. They weren't trying to insult him. They were trying to convince themselves he didn't matter enough to be part of this. But Richard knew. He covered his face with his hands, his voice cracking. "Please stop talking. You don't understand." The investigator turned to him. "Then help us understand." Richard swallowed hard. His gaze drifted to Marcus again, full of guilt and something that looked dangerously close to remorse. 7 years ago, Richard whispered, I approved a security response without fully checking the details. The man they stopped wasn't the suspect. He wasn't armed. He wasn't doing anything wrong. The investigator leaned in. And what happened to him? Richard's voice broke. He was injured badly, and instead of admitting it, I let the case be closed quietly. I told myself it was a misunderstanding, a mistake, but it was. Executives stared at him, as if hearing about the incident for the first time. One asked softly, "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" Richard turned to Marcus. I thought he was gone. I thought he'd never want to see this place again. And then, when he applied for a job 2 years ago, I recognized him immediately. The room went still. He came back, Richard whispered, and I didn't know why. I thought maybe he wanted revenge. Marcus inhaled sharply, the first sign of emotion he had shown since stepping inside. Richard's voice dropped to a broken whisper. But he never said anything. He never confronted me. He never even looked at me like he knew who I was. Marcus finally spoke. Maybe I didn't want to be seen. Those words struck the room like a stone through glass. The investigator stepped back, studying Marcus with new humanity. Mr. Daniels, is it true? Were you the injured party? Marcus looked at the long table, at the men and women whose decisions shaped the lives of thousands. He looked at Richard, a man who had everything, and yet stood trembling like someone standing at the edge of a confession. He spoke quietly. I didn't come back here for revenge. The executives exhaled in relief too soon. Marcus continued. I came back because I wanted to know if anything here had changed. His voice didn't rise. He didn't sound angry. He sounded tired, like someone who had carried the weight of 7 years without once letting it crush him. The investigator nodded slowly. So you are the victim. Marcus didn't answer with anger or pride. He just said, I was the man you hurt. Richard closed his eyes, a single tear sliding from the corner before he wiped it away quickly, hoping no one noticed. But everyone noticed. The boardroom door opened suddenly as another lawyer rushed in, handing a document to the investigator. We found surveillance photos from that night, she said breathlessly. The timestamp matches the incident. The face matches Mr. Daniels. Executives gasped again. No one in that room looked at Marcus like the janitor anymore. They looked at him like the truth they had been trying to bury. Marcus stepped back, giving them space to absorb the revelation. His hands rested calmly at his sides, too calm for a man reliving trauma. But that was the thing about Marcus Daniels. He'd learned to hold himself together, even when the world tried to pull him apart. The investigator took a deep breath. Mr. Daniels will need a full account of what happened that night. Marcus stared at the long table, the same table where people made decisions that changed lives without ever seeing the ones affected. His voice was steady, almost unnervingly calm. I'll tell you everything, he said, but not because you deserve to hear it, because I deserve to say it. The room held its breath. The truth was finally walking into the light. And it was only the beginning. The room felt colder now, like someone had opened a window to a winter night that didn't exist. No one spoke. No one shuffled papers. Even the humming of the ceiling lights seemed to fade as Marcus walked toward the center of the long table. He didn't look like a janitor anymore. He looked like a man who had carried a truth so heavy that the moment he set it down, its weight shook everyone who heard it. The investigator raised his pen. Mr. Daniels, whenever you're ready. Marcus nodded, though his eyes stayed distant, like they were staring through time instead of people. It was late, he began softly. I had come to the building for a meeting about a new contract. I was early, too early maybe, and I walked through the wrong hallway at the wrong time. Executives leaned forward, their guilt starting to bloom in uncomfortable silence. One of the security officers stopped me, asked for ID, I gave it, everything looked fine. But then another guard came, said there had been a report of someone suspicious, someone matching my description. He let the words sit. Matching my description. He didn't need to say more, they all understood. Marcus continued, quieter now. They started questioning me, not listening, not slowing down. I wasn't resisting. I wasn't doing anything wrong, but one officer was nervous, maybe too aggressive, maybe too scared, and they used force. A few board members looked down, ashamed. Marcus didn't describe the violence. He didn't need to. His voice alone showed enough. I remember the floor, the cold tile. I remember voices telling me not to move. I remember thinking that if I said one wrong word, I wouldn't walk out. Richard covered his face again. Marcus's tone didn't change. Calm, controlled, like someone who had learned to tell his story without letting it drown him. When they realized I wasn't who they thought, they tried to fix it quietly. They helped me up, told me it was a misunderstanding, offered a private doctor, offered money, told me not to make trouble. Marcus paused. I said nothing, I just left. A soft, broken whisper came from the CEO, and I signed the paperwork saying you were unharmed. Marcus looked at Richard with a steady gaze. No hate, no sympathy, just truth. You signed it because admitting the mistake would have ruined a few careers. The words hit like a slow, deliberate strike. The investigator turned toward Richard. Is that correct? Richard swallowed. Yes, it was a different time, bad press, the company, I made the wrong choice. The investigator wrote something down, his expression unreadable. Marcus took a slow breath. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. Every loud sound felt like someone coming behind me. Every shadow felt like that hallway again. And when I tried to talk to someone about it, people told me to let it go. Move on, forget. He looked at the executives. You don't forget moments like that. You learn to carry them. The room was silent. One executive whispered, why come back here? Why work for the same company that hurt you? This time Marcus actually smiled. Not happily, not bitterly, just knowingly. I came back because if I ran from the place that broke me, it would own me forever. I came back to see whether the people who hurt me had changed, whether the company had changed. He glanced around the table. And to be honest, I wasn't sure until today. The investigator closed the folder slowly. Mr. Daniels, we're going to need an internal hearing, testimonies, evidence. The board must decide how to move forward. But I want you to know this time you're not invisible. It was the first time anyone in that building had said words that didn't feel empty. Marcus nodded. I'm not here to punish anyone, I just want the truth. Richard's voice shook, and you'll have it, I swear it. But the boardroom doors opened again, and a woman in a navy blazer stepped in, clutching her phone like it was burning her hand. There's a problem, she said urgently. The investigator frowned. What kind of problem? She turned the phone toward them. A leak, someone leaked the story to the media. Reporters are downstairs, news networks, social platforms. They already know a janitor is accusing the company of a buried violence incident. Executives erupted into worried murmurs. The woman added, they know the CEO is involved. Everyone turned to Richard. Everyone except Marcus. He was staring at the floor, unreadable. Richard stood up, shaking. This can't be happening already, we just started the inquiry. The investigator narrowed his eyes. Only people in this room know the details. A heavy silence followed. Someone in that room had tried to get ahead of the disaster. Someone wanted control. Someone wanted the narrative shaped before facts were revealed. The investigator stepped forward. No one leaves, not until we figure out who leaked it. Executives froze. Marcus finally looked up. I told you, he said calmly, the truth always finds a way out. And this time it wasn't the building shaking. It was the people inside it. Executives sat frozen, their faces tightening as the weight of the leak pressed down on the room. Some whispered in panic. Some stared straight ahead, already imagining their names on headlines. And some were studying each other, eyes sharp, calculating. The investigator paced slowly, not accusing anyone yet, just letting the tension cook. We're going to take this step by step, he said. Who had a motive to leak? Who benefits from this going public now before we finish? Richard's voice cracked as he spoke. Whoever did this, you've put the entire company at risk. You've put me at risk. You've put Marcus in danger. Do you understand what this will look like out there? But Marcus didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid of the world outside. He had been afraid inside this building for far too long. An older board member leaned back, crossing his arms tightly. Maybe the leak is a good thing. Maybe transparency is exactly what we need. Another snapped, "You say that now, when it's not your signature on the cover-up." The investigator raised a hand for silence, but it only partially worked. Tension had grown roots in the room. No one trusted anyone. No one knew who was protecting what. He turned toward Marcus. "Did you tell anyone, family, friends, anyone who might have shared your story?" Marcus shook his head. "I haven't spoken about that night in years." The investigator nodded. "Then someone in this room leaked the story, someone who wants control of what happens next." Richard looked around at the people he'd worked with for decades, people who once clapped at his speeches, people who praised his leadership. Now, some of those same faces looked at him like he was a burden dragging the company underwater. And he knew exactly why. If Richard went down, some of them would too. A woman at the far end of the table finally spoke, her voice trembling. "There's something else." Everyone turned. She swallowed hard. "I received an anonymous email last night. It said the truth always comes back and that I should prepare for the storm." The investigator's eyes sharpened. "Who sent it?" She shook her head. "No name, no address, just that message, and a single line at the end." The executive with the phone whispered, "What line?" The woman took a breath. "You cannot bury what breathes." Those words traveled through the room like a cold, thin wind. Marcus lifted his head slowly. His expression wasn't fear. It was recognition. The investigator noticed. "You know that phrase." Marcus hesitated. "I've heard it before." Executives turned toward him. Richard stepped closer. "From who, when?" Marcus closed his eyes for a second, then opened them. The night the incident happened, one officer whispered those words to the other. I never forgot them, because I didn't understand them. The investigator froze. Everyone froze. Because that meant something far bigger than a mistake. Far bigger than a misunderstanding. Had happened that night. A board member leaned forward. "Are you saying the officers planned something, that they weren't acting out of fear, but out of?" Marcus exhaled. "I don't know, but I do know this. Someone who remembers that line, someone connected to that night, sent that email." Richard's voice wavered. "Then that means someone in law enforcement, or someone linked to them, knows what's happening today." The investigator's jaw clenched. "This goes beyond the company. Someone is pushing this story into the open." The room sank deeper into silence, heavier now, like the air itself was thickening. Marcus looked up, studying every face. "There's something you all need to understand. I didn't come here to destroy anyone. I came here because I wanted to see if the people who broke me still had power over me." He paused. "But if this leak forces the truth out faster, then maybe it's time the world knew what really happens behind these doors." A younger executive stood abruptly. "We need to get ahead of this. Tell the media our version before they twist it." The investigator snapped. "No one speaks to the press. Not one word. Whoever leaked wants chaos. We're not giving it to them." But chaos was already spreading. From the hallway outside, hurried footsteps approached. A different employee stepped in, breathless. "They're inside the building," she said. "News crews, 2 major networks. They're demanding statements, and security says someone let them through the second-floor entrance." The investigator's head snapped toward the door. "Someone opened the building to them." She nodded, not by accident. Someone used an internal access code. Executives gasped. This wasn't a leak anymore. This was a breach. Richard's hands trembled as he looked at Marcus, a man he once dismissed, a man he once hurt, and now the only person in the room who seemed steady. "What do you want us to do?" Richard asked. Everyone turned toward Marcus. A janitor. A man they ignored for years. A man whose voice had once been buried under signatures and excuses. He looked at the door where reporters were gathering outside. He looked at the executives who had built their careers on silence. He looked at the investigator waiting for leadership. And Marcus finally answered. "Tell the truth," he said, "all of it today." No one breathed. Richard whispered, "If we do that, everything falls apart." Marcus held his gaze. Sometimes things need to fall apart, so better things can be built. The investigator stepped forward. Then that's what we'll do, but first we need to find whoever opened those doors. As he spoke, a figure appeared in the doorway. Someone none of them expected. Someone whose presence made every person in the room straighten in shock. Their entrance would turn rising action into a storm. The figure in the doorway stepped fully into the boardroom, and every breath in the room seemed to vanish at once. It was the retired security chief, the man who'd overseen the entire department the night Marcus was hurt. His hair was grayer now, his face heavier, the weight of years sitting in his eyes like he'd been waiting for this moment longer than anyone else. He wasn't supposed to be here. He didn't work for the company anymore. And yet, he stood in the room like he owned the air they were breathing. The investigator straightened. "How did you get in this building?" "I still have friends," the ex-chief said softly. "And I heard the truth was finally knocking, thought I'd come see who opened the door." Executives shifted nervously. Some tried to hide their recognition, others didn't bother. Richard stepped forward. "Why now, after all these years?" The chief looked directly at Marcus, not at Richard. "Because he deserves to hear the truth from the mouth of the man who supervised the people who hurt him." Marcus stayed still, not scared, not angry, just ready. "Then tell it," the investigator demanded. "We're past secrets." The room held its breath. The chief walked to the center, moving slowly, like every step reminded him of a memory he'd buried too deeply. "That night," he began, "my department wasn't acting alone. There was pressure, orders." He looked at Richard, then at the board. "Not from the company, from outside." Executives frowned, confused. Marcus watched him carefully. The chief continued. "There was a tip that someone was planning to break into confidential research. The description they gave matched." His eyes dropped. "Matched a vague profile, one that unfairly pointed to someone who looked like Marcus." He paused. But the problem wasn't the tip. The problem was the mindset. When they found Marcus, they didn't give him the benefit of the doubt. They assumed the worst. They let fear speak louder than sense. Marcus exhaled slowly. He already knew that part. He had lived it. But the chief wasn't finished. "And after they realized the mistake, after they saw your ID, after they understood you were here for a meeting," he swallowed. "The officers panicked. They called me, told me what happened, and I made the worst decision of my career." He looked up, meeting Marcus's eyes. "I ordered them to write it off as a misunderstanding. I thought it would protect everyone. I thought it would keep the department from collapsing. I thought it would keep the company from exploding." Richard's face went white. Because covering it up meant he hadn't been the first one. He had only signed the final page. The chief continued, voice strained. "I shouldn't have done it. I shouldn't have signed off on hiding a moment that never should have happened in the first place." The investigator's voice cut through. "Why leak the story today?" The chief closed his eyes for a second. "Because I knew if the board handled this quietly again, the truth would never see daylight. Someone needed to force your hand. Someone who knew how you all think." Executives stared in disbelief. "You leaked it?" the investigator asked. "Yes," he didn't hesitate. "I let the media in. I sent the email because I knew if I didn't, you'd bury him again." The room erupted. Accusations, shock, anger. But Marcus stayed silent. The chief turned toward him. "I know an apology doesn't fix what happened, but you deserve more than silence. You deserved it then, and you deserve it now." Marcus studied him. "Why now? Why not 15 years ago?" The chief's voice broke. "Because back then I cared too much about my job, and today all I care about is my conscience." The investigator stepped forward. "Chief, you're coming with me. You're going to testify publicly." The chief nodded. He expected that. But this wasn't the end. From the hallway, the sound of raised voices echoed closer. Reporters were pushing security. Cameras were being forced through the door. The media storm had arrived. Executives panicked. "We can't let them film this. This will destroy us. This company will never recover." Richard looked at Marcus, eyes filled with something complicated, fear, regret, and something else. Something almost human. "What do you want me to do?" Richard asked quietly. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He looked around the room, people sweating, yelling, hiding. People who had never imagined that one man's truth could shake the pillars they'd built careers on. Then he looked at the chief, broken but finally honest. And finally, he looked at himself. A simple janitor, standing taller than the people who once stood over him. "Tell them the truth," Marcus repeated. "If any of you walk out there with lies, this cycle repeats." The investigator nodded. He's right. But the board was divided. Half wanted to come clean. Half wanted survival. One executive spoke sharply. "If we admit everything, the stock drops, the board gets replaced, our contracts collapse. This destroys the company." Marcus stepped closer to him. "The company isn't the victim here," he said. "I am, and people like me, people who get ignored, questioned, doubted because of how we look." Silence. Marcus continued, voice strong. "You're scared of losing money. I was scared of losing my life." Those words hit the table harder than any lawsuit ever could. The chief stepped forward. "He's right, and if this company falls apart because the truth came out, then it deserved to." Richard rubbed his face, trembling, exhausted, human in a way he had never allowed himself to be. He looked at Marcus with wet eyes. "What would justice look like to you?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Accountability, change, not just a press release, not just a payout, real change, real protection for the people who walk into this building every day, real training, real courage." Richard inhaled shakily. "Then you'll have it." The board murmured in shock, unsure whether they were witnessing the collapse of their world or the start of something new. But the moment wasn't finished. Security rushed in and whispered to the investigator. "They're inside the hallway. Cameras are already rolling." Richard straightened. He wiped his face. He looked at Marcus. "Will you stand with me?" he asked, "when we face them?" Marcus paused. He wasn't asking as a CDO. He wasn't asking as the man who once signed the cover-up. He was asking as a man ready to be judged. Marcus stepped forward. "I'll stand," he said, "but not behind you, beside you." Richard nodded slowly. "Beside me, then." Together, they walked toward the doors. Executives watched, stunned. Some ashamed, some afraid, some relieved. The chief followed behind, ready to face the consequences of truth. The investigator walked with him, ready to hold every person accountable. As the doors opened, the light of dozens of cameras flooded in, bright, unforgiving, almost blinding. Reporters shouted questions. Microphones pushed forward. People demanded answers. But in the center of the chaos, Marcus and Richard stepped out side by side. And the entire room, the entire building went silent. Cameras pointed. Phones lifted. 100 voices waited. Richard inhaled deeply. "Today," he began, "we tell the truth." Then he stepped back, and Marcus stepped forward. A janitor. A man ignored. A man underestimated. A man they once tried to silence. He looked into the cameras, into the world watching, into the eyes of every person who had ever been doubted or dismissed or unseen. "My name is Marcus Daniels," he said, "and this is what happened to me." The rest of the world didn't know it yet. But this moment, this breath, this truth, was about to change everything. The room emptied slowly, the chaos outside fading to a dull roar in the distance. Marcus stood near the edge of the boardroom, the bright lights of cameras and flashes still flickering in his vision, but he wasn't looking at them. He wasn't even looking at Richard. He was looking at the floor he had walked every day for years, the polished tiles that once reflected only his own careful steps, now reflecting a truth that had finally been seen. Richard Hale remained near the center, shoulders slumped, a man stripped of the veneer of power. No suit could protect him from what had just happened. For the first time in decades, he had faced a moment he could not control, a moment he could not manipulate, a moment where honesty was the only path forward. He looked at Marcus and said nothing. Words felt inadequate. Apologies felt inadequate. But he knew Marcus's silence held more weight than any of the frantic explanations or legal statements he could muster. Outside the boardroom, reporters pushed through the glass doors, eager for the statement, the confession, the headline. But Marcus didn't flinch. He had rehearsed nothing, expected nothing, and yet he knew the story had already been told, inside this room where the people who mattered had finally heard him. The cameras, the shouting, the flashes, it was all secondary. What mattered was that the truth now existed, undeniable and unshakable. The retired security chief approached quietly, his steps cautious. "You did what you needed to do," he said softly. "You didn't wait for anyone's permission, you made them see." Marcus nodded, acknowledging him without needing to speak. They both understood that the power of the moment was not in vindictiveness or revenge, it was in being seen and finally being heard. Richard finally found his voice. "Marcus, I don't know how to make up for what we did, but I want to try. I will do everything in my power to make things right." His hands shook, his expression raw. "The company will change. Policies, training, accountability. No one else should ever go through what you did." Marcus studied him for a long moment. He had been preparing for anger, for shouting, for some sort of retribution. But instead, he felt something heavier, the weight of the years he had carried slowly lifting as he realized that the man who once had the power to ruin him now understood the gravity of his own mistakes. "Then make it real," Marcus said quietly. "Not just for me, for everyone who can't speak, for everyone who's invisible." Richard's eyes filled with tears, not a calculated emotion, not a performance for cameras, real human tears. "It will be," he whispered. The board members who remained were still frozen in shock. Some avoided eye contact. Some couldn't believe that a janitor, a man they had overlooked for years, had delivered a moral reckoning none of them had expected. And yet none of them could deny it. Marcus had given them the truth, and in doing so, he had exposed the fragility of their constructed authority. The investigator stepped forward, turning to address the room. "This is only the beginning. There will be hearings, statements, and investigations, but for the first time, we're not hiding anything. And for the first time, the person who was wronged is part of the process. That's what justice looks like." A quiet reflection fell over Marcus. He thought about the nights of sleepless terror, about the streets he had walked in silence, about the walls he had built around himself to survive. He realized now that the fear he had carried for 7 years, the tension in every step he had taken in this building, had been slowly replaced by something else: purpose. Standing here in a room filled with people who had once ignored him, he understood that purpose was louder than fear, and dignity was stronger than silence. Hours later, the building was calmer. The cameras had gone, leaving behind the hushed murmurs of employees processing what had happened. Marcus returned to the floors he had cleaned for years, carrying his mop and bucket as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Every tile he touched now reflected not just his labor, but his courage, his resilience, and the knowledge that he had claimed a space for himself in a world that had tried to erase him. Richard walked past him quietly, no words this time, just a nod. It was a silent acknowledgement of what had been done, of what was owed, and of the fact that power could no longer overshadow truth. Marcus nodded back. For the first time, there was no fear in his eyes. There was only recognition. He had survived. He had been heard. He had changed the narrative. Over the next days, the company began to shift. Internal reviews were initiated, policies revised, and the leadership team faced accountability in ways they had never imagined. Employees who had felt invisible for years began to speak up. Voices that had been silenced found strength in Marcus's example. What had started as one man's confrontation with a past injustice became a movement within the walls of a corporation, a reminder that dignity, once claimed, could ripple outward in ways no one anticipated. Marcus received a private message from the retired security chief one evening. It was brief, almost casual. "You did the right thing. You set the record straight. People will remember this." Marcus smiled slightly. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of the past settle into a sense of completion, not pain. Richard requested a private meeting with him, away from cameras, away from lawyers and boards. When Marcus arrived, he found the CEO seated humbly in a simple office, the arrogance stripped away. "I owe you more than words," Richard said quietly. "I've spent years thinking I could protect the company by hiding mistakes. I see now that protecting people is more important than protecting reputations." Marcus nodded. "Then start protecting people, not just here, everywhere this company touches." Richard's face softened. "I will, and I will make sure your story is part of the training for every employee so no one else ever feels invisible." The conversation ended without ceremony. No cameras, no headlines, no applause. Just two men, one who had suffered, one who had wielded power, and a quiet, mutual understanding that change had begun. Walking out of the office that evening, Marcus felt the air outside differently. The streets seemed less hostile. The city lights were sharper, warmer, somehow acknowledging that he had reclaimed something that had been taken from him. The world hadn't changed entirely. Injustice still existed, but he had altered a corner of it. He had rewritten part of the narrative, not with vengeance, but with truth and dignity. He paused near the entrance of the building and looked up at the glass towers reflecting the evening sky. For the first time, the reflection wasn't just of a man who cleaned floors. It was of a man who had stood tall when the world had tried to erase him, a man whose hands, once used for labor, now recognized for their strength, had moved with purpose and shifted an entire room. As he walked away, leaving the building behind, Marcus knew something profound. The silence that had followed him for years was broken. Not by luck, not by accident, not by anyone else, but by him, and the world finally had to see him. Weeks later, the story spread. Media coverage highlighted Marcus's courage and the company's acknowledgement of its mistakes. Employees shared their experiences, inspired by one man who refused to be invisible. Richard Hale faced scrutiny but committed to real change. Lawsuits were addressed, policies rewritten, and in every report, in every retelling, Marcus's name carried weight, the weight of truth, resilience, and unshakable dignity. Even after the world had seen him, Marcus didn't seek recognition. He returned to his work quietly, carefully, the same man who had pushed a mop across polished floors for years. But now every step, every motion carried something more. A reminder that he had the right to exist fully, to claim space, to move without fear. That the past, no matter how long buried, could be confronted, and justice, true justice, could finally be recognized. At the end of one long day, Marcus stood in the empty lobby, the setting sun casting gold across the marble floors. He looked down at his hands, strong, steady, unshaken. Hands that had endured, hands that had carried him through years of silence, hands that had moved and caused a room to stop, a CEO to beg, and the truth to finally rise. He whispered to himself softly, not for anyone else to hear, "It's done, finally it's done." And in that quiet moment, Marcus Daniels felt the weight lift. Not the weight of recognition, not the weight of fame, but the weight of truth. The world had seen him. The world had to reckon with what he had endured. And for the first time in years, Marcus didn't feel small. He didn't feel invisible. He felt whole. The story of Marcus Daniels is not just a story about one man. It is a story about truth, dignity, and the courage to stand even when the world has ignored you for years. It is about the quiet strength of people who are overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed, and how that strength can shake the walls of power when it finally speaks. Marcus didn't seek revenge. He didn't demand recognition. He simply chose to confront the injustice done to him, and in doing so, he reminded everyone in that room and everyone watching the world unfold that silence can no longer protect wrongdoing. Courage is not loud or flashy. Sometimes it is just a pair of steady hands, a calm voice, and the decision to be seen when the world expects you to stay invisible. The CEO, the executives, and the board learned something that day that no policy, no lawsuit, and no meeting could have taught them. That power without accountability is fragile, and that compassion, honesty, and accountability are stronger than fear, secrecy, and status. Marcus's actions changed the narrative, not just for himself, but for every employee who had ever felt powerless. This story is a reminder that the smallest, most overlooked voices in our world can carry the greatest weight. That justice is not always immediate, but it arrives when we refuse to accept lies, cover-ups, or silence. That redemption is possible, not by erasing mistakes, but by confronting them, learning from them, and doing better. And for anyone watching this story, take this lesson to heart. Never underestimate the quiet, the diligent, or the overlooked. The person who seems invisible today may be the one who inspires change tomorrow. Stand for truth, speak with integrity, and remember that one courageous act can ripple far beyond what you imagine. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let the story of Marcus Daniels remind you that no injustice is too deep to confront, no voice too small to matter, and no one is invisible when they choose to stand for what is right. Because sometimes the hands that clean floors, the hands that move quietly through life, are the hands that can make the world stop, listen, and finally pay attention.